How's it going? We're gonna do a little quick video over start of the Civil War stuff. Please make sure if you have not that you turn in your open note, open book test. If you have turned those in, I've already returned them to you. I've graded them. The numbers that you see in the comment is which questions you've missed. Obviously, I hope we could figure that out. A couple of you asked me what those numbers were. I don't just write random numbers on your tests. It's not a riddle. It's the numbers you missed. All the answers in the book, so make sure you go back over those. If you don't like your grade, correct it, I guess, and then just resubmit it. I'll get them done as soon as possible. Make sure also that you complete the Fort Sumter activity by Friday, right? So to start the Civil War, we're going to talk about sort of the battle lines being drawn, right? States that are in the border between these Confederates, the ones that had left the Union, right, and the United States, they kind of have hard choices to make, right? They have to decide if they want to remain with the Union or leave. And one thing you'll notice in this picture is the red line is the border between the Confederate states and the Union states. Green states are free, gray are slave. You see that there are gray slave states still in the Union, right? That should be something that sticks out. And that's because not every slave state actually left. There were a couple that stayed. And in fact, this is when West Virginia is formed. They break away from Virginia because they did not want to secede, right? These border states kind of have it rough because while they stayed with the Union, obviously not everyone living there wanted to, right? There's going to be some people who own slaves in those states that wanted to leave. And that's going to cause a lot of issues, particularly when you look at areas like Missouri. They had these massive issues of rebellions and protests happening in these border states, ones that wanted to leave. And President Lincoln actually suspends habeas corpus in these border states, which is actually a pretty massive stretch of presidential power, right? So what habeas corpus is it's basically if you are arrested, that you have the right to be brought before a judge, right? That you have the right to be told why you're being arrested. You have the right to sort of go through the legal system. If that's suspended, you are not guaranteed that right. In theory, with habeas corpus suspended, you could be thrown in jail without being told what you've done for an indefinite amount of time. And that was an attempt to stop protests in these border states, but it's also a pretty scary thing. And I think if a less popular president in the North would have tried that, there would have been, large, huge protests happening. But because of the time period, there's literally a civil war happening. States are leaving the Union. People are kind of less willing to push back on that. So it's an interesting sort of use of presidential power by Lincoln. Missouri being under martial law, it's also kind of a scary thing. I mean, that means that you literally have the military becomes your police force, right? Military and police are not the same thing, right? You kind of don't want your military to be your police. They're kind of trained for very different purposes. Again, it's all about trying to keep or maintain the peace in those border states, but it comes at a cost, right? Native Americans kind of surprisingly side with the Confederates. It's kind of like when we talked about, with the War of 1812, when the natives sided with, Britain. It's interesting to see, where these tribes pick sides from. I mean, either way, neither the Confederacy nor the United States have really been particularly great to Native Americans, right? But the idea here is the Confederacy is a new country, and so they're promising better treatment of natives. And for a lot of them, that's appealing enough that makes them want to, support the South. This doesn't include every single tribe, but a large majority of natives were siding with the Confederates. In terms of what sort of the strengths and weaknesses were on these sides, the North has way more strengths going into this war than the South. This is a map of railroads. You can see a lot more red up here than the South. Industry, before we got to this unit, right? We talked about how industry just happened a lot more in the North. They had access to more factories, more production was done there than when you're talking about a place in the South. And that, in time of a civil war, means you have a huge advantage in terms of what you can make, right? Weaponry, Even something as simple as uniforms, stuff like that becomes, way easier in the North versus the South. Transportation of soldiers becomes much easier, and the North had an absolutely massive navy compared to the South. So in terms of like supplies and military, North looks good. Now, the one area that they don't look good, and the one thing that really leads to a huge disadvantage as to why, and one of the reasons as to why this war took so long, the Confederacy has vastly superior military leaders, experienced leaders, people who knew how to command soldiers, people who knew how to, pull victories, right? And that's a huge deal. You can have a state-of-the-art army. You can have all the supplies you need. But if you can't command your soldiers as well as the other guy, doesn't matter, right? It's not going to help. Like I said, it's one of the reasons this war stretches out for a while. And even at the end of it, and I don't want to talk down about Ulysses S. Grant, great guy, goes on to become president, whoopee. Not the best general in the world. Kind of wins the war based off of having way more soldiers at his disposal. When you look at some of the casualty numbers between North and South, even at the end of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant is losing like twice as many soldiers on average that Robert E. Lee was losing. I mean, that's not a great commander, right? That's a guy who's winning by throwing soldiers at you. And in particular, two leaders that are very famous in the South are, like I said, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson. These guys are both big names, or sort of the famous leaders of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee was involved with the United States military before this whole war happens, right? When there was the raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown, when he went in and tried to arm those slaves, and he was arrested and eventually executed. The guy who caught him was Robert E. Lee, who at the time was a colonel who got brought in to catch this guy, right? He hid in a barn. They got him. When the war started, President Lincoln wrote a letter to Robert E. Lee asking him to lead the Union. He said, you're a great military commander. Your country needs you. Robert E. Lee famously wrote a letter back to Abraham Lincoln declining helping him out, saying something along the lines of the direct quotes like that I'm a Virginian first and an American second, that he put his state before his country. And that was the mentality of a lot of people in the South, this idea of you're identifying with the state you're from, not the country you're in. And so he was willing to literally secede from the Union, leave his job in the military to lead his state into the Confederacy. Remember that the Confederacy is all these states that had left the Union, but it's kind of a weird government because each state is independent to an extent. Remember, Confederacy is like a group of allies working together. There is a president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, but he's not the same as a president like the president of the United States. There's not a strong federal government in the Confederacy. There's a lot of expecting states to work together, and that's going to be one of the reasons why the South will eventually lose. Is it's hard for them. They can't require states to give money. They can't require states to give soldiers. They can only request, and it's a big downside to the Confederacy because it becomes a lot of infighting amongst these states. But and Stonewall Jackson is going to be one of these guys that ends up having this uncanny ability to pull major victories in battles that seemed like he couldn't win. He gets the nickname Stonewall because one of the first battles of the Civil War, his soldiers supposedly don't take a single step backwards. I don't know how true that is. I'm sure some people took a step backwards, but allegedly during this battle, they didn't lose a single step of ground, right? So that's where the nickname comes. Sticks with him until eventually he dies in battle, getting shot partially by his own soldiers. So, oops. You'll hear the term Yankee and Rebel. Yankees sort of referring to people in the North, Rebel referring to the Southerners. Both sides have massive amounts of people ready to enlist. They both saw this as being a relatively short war. Children as young as 10 years old are signing up to join the military. And obviously in some places, there's a lot of exceptions being made, because I don't think most 11-year-olds can fool people into thinking that they're 18 years old wanting to enlist in the Army. But don't get the idea that there's like a bunch of 11-year-old kids in the front lines charging in the bayonets. They're not generally being given a lot of combat positions. So kids might serve as people who deliver letters, or bugle boys who are playing the actual instruments for armies when they march, that kind of stuff. Were there children fighting? Yes, but there weren't like units of death squad children. So don't be thinking about that. A percentage here that always kind of shocks me: 10 to 20% were 16 years old or younger. That's kind of a massive chunk of your military forces being children, right? It's a very young war, and it's a far-reaching one, because you have not just young children, but you're going to see, like, in some of these places, in these border areas, you have families on both sides of this conflict. You'll have like cousins, or these larger families who are like actually shooting at each other. It's a weird sort of thing to think about. Remember, at the end of this war, that everyone who dies in this is an American, right? Even though they're rebelling, these people who are dying in this war are American citizens. It's a really tragic war in terms of the country's population, right? Women are going to be involved as well. So in some cases, you have women like actually disguising themselves and enlisting as men in the armies. And you also have women volunteering on the front lines as nurses. One of the things that's really creepy about this, nursing, being a medic during the Civil War, is probably one of the more gruesome wars that you could be involved in medically, because the technology available at the time is not great. Infection killed more people in the Civil War than bullets, according to some stats. And that's because like the getting shot part wasn't the thing that killed a lot of these people. You get shot in the arm, you died from that bullet wound getting infected. The number one treatment during the Civil War for an injury was amputation. So they bring you into a tent, you get shot in the arm or leg, they would literally remove your arm or leg. Painkillers were not great at the time period. They give you something to bite down on, they might give you a drink of alcohol, and then they begin sawing through your arm or your leg. If you got shot in the torso, you're most likely going to die from infection. People who got amputations had to be very careful with them, because those could get infected. So not only would you have to go through the pain of them cutting off your arm while you're awake, at least until you passed out, then it gets infected and they have to do it again. They have to cut it farther up. There's descriptions from doctors and nurses in some of these field medic tents where they said there were literal piles of arms and legs that they had to be removed. That they'd bring someone in, remove a limb, move on to the next one. So they talk about like PTSD, the idea of like the stress and trauma of war. And I think in the Civil War, there was probably a large chunk of medical professionals who came out of that pretty mentally scarred. You could imagine having to go through and amputate the limbs of all these people, how that would sort of take a toll on you, right? It's gruesome stuff. And that it's as bad as it would be to get shot or stabbed with the bayonet, dying of infection in a time period where they just don't have medicines to treat it can't be a pleasant experience, right? Very sort of extreme situations, and it'll get worse as the war drags on. Some battles are worse than others, but definitely really dangerous stuff. In terms of African Americans, one of the things that happens these sort of first 2 years of the war is that Abraham Lincoln sort of pushes back a lot against this idea of using African American soldiers. There were a lot of people in the North, free, former slaves, people who were never slaves, who wanted to enlist in the army and help fight. But there's kind of two big reasons that they're being pushed against. One is there's still racism in the North. There's white soldiers who do not want to fight alongside black soldiers. They just didn't want to do it. And two, Lincoln and his advisors at the beginning of the war thought that if you want the South to surrender, to come back around, to not, maintain this rebellion, then you need to not sort of make their worst nightmare come true, which is black people with guns coming into their country, right? If you send in these armies of black soldiers, there's concern that that's going to make them fight even harder, make them even less likely to, surrender and rejoin the Union. So for the first two years of the war, Lincoln was very much against letting African Americans fight. Eventually that'll change, right? The war drags on, he will change his mind on that. And that's a picture of the movie Glory, which back in my day, we used to watch that in class. Fun times. Okay, a couple things real quick. We'll wrap this up. Going into this war, very different goals. First of all, the South is fighting what's called the defensive war, right? They are not looking at the start of the war to invade the North. They had no plans to leave countries like Virginia and go fight in northern states. They wanted to stay within the Confederacy. So a defensive war has a huge number of advantages, right? You know that the enemy has to come to you. You know the layout of your land. You know where you want to fight them. You know that if you need supplies, it is easier for you to get access to those supplies than it is for these, northern states to bring them in, right? So there's a lot of advantages there. And the South's goal is basically, one, make this war too expensive. Drag it out, right? Make the North not want to fight this anymore. And two, get a couple victories so some foreign countries will send you some aid, right? Make some good trade deals. The South produced a lot of cotton that was imported, into European countries. They have to prove that they can win, though. You can't just write to France and be like, hey, give us some money, we're going to fight for independence. They're not going to back you unless you prove you can win or at least drag the war out. For the North, their idea was to go to Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy, which is fairly close to the North. It's not very deep into the Confederacy. They thought a quick march to Richmond would allow them to, cut off the head of this new government. What they're going to find is that the fact that they don't have really great military leadership makes this much more difficult than they thought, right? Neither side has a well-trained army. Neither side has people who have seen a lot of combat. The South has the better leaders who have seen some, but there's some huge concerns over what that means in the long run if you have all these soldiers that aren't quite ready, right? And then lastly, we'll stop here. We'll talk about the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run first. This is an interesting battle because it's a battle that had spectators. People from the northern government came in by the wagon load and had a picnic on a hill a couple miles off of where this battle took place. The Northern General McDowell said this was going to be a very fast victory. And so congressmen and reporters brought their families, and on the hillside miles away from this battle, they laid out blankets and they had a little picnic while they watched Northerners and Southerners kill each other. And sort of interesting phenomenon happens. They're watching the battle over, a couple miles away, and the battle line begins to shift. Stonewall Jackson and his soldiers, they don't give any of this ground. They start to get pushed back. And eventually, the battle actually rolls backwards towards these northern congressmen and reporters that had been there to watch the battle. And there are accounts of northern soldiers who were fleeing, retreating, running up the hill and stealing the wagons and horses of reporters and congressmen and leaving them behind, riding away, fleeing away. Right? And this was that first battle of the Civil War. It was supposed to be so easy. And it ends with this humiliating defeat with people literally running for the hills. Right? Sort of set the tone for the whole war. I think it's at this point people started to realize that things sort of were not going the direction that they'd expected. Right? And it will take a while for the North to sort of get back around. But yeah. So we'll stop there for this. Make sure you're getting your work done. Get that test in if you haven't. Have a good one.